This is something Max Verstappen probably didn't want to hear right now, because another Red Bull senior staff member has quit, and we're only 19 days away from Lights Out in Melbourne. Red Bull have indeed confirmed that their chief designer, Craig Skinner, has stepped down with immediate effect after 2 decades with the team, right on the doorstep of round 1 of F1 2026. My immediate thought, though, I do think back to when Rob Marshall departed the team back in 2023 and headed on over to McLaren. That the disruption wasn't necessarily immediate because they went on, Red Bull, to have a dominant year with the RB19, but as we saw throughout 2024 with the RB20, that did become a monster that needed to be tamed. So is this particular resignation a sign that Red Bull is ultimately doomed? Well, not necessarily, but the timing is still a little bit awkward because, well, look at all the headlines it's generated. But it is awkward because of the feedback loop for this year's car, about who owns the final call when the aerodynamic data comes back from the test and it might look a bit ugly. And it's also difficult because everyone's probably knackered after 3 rounds of testing, as opposed to the typical singular outing teams get pre-season. And of course finding out the first race whether or not the Red Bull RB22 is indeed the benchmark or not. But I don't blame you for naturally feeling a little bit spooked, because this is all happening just weeks before Australia, before the beginning of this brand new regulation cycle, and this important Red Bull figure has decided to just leave the organisation. You know, where there are new rules at play here, there are new power units, there are new challenges to try and conquer, as well as trying to win the hearts of the Formula One fans, which have definitely been shaken in recent times, because right now we're trying to find answers to questions about whether or not this sport is even the same thing anymore. So naturally, we're all thinking, okay, Red Bull is definitely toast then. Well, we thought about that when Adrian Newey departed, that the team would completely crumble. 2 years later, they're still here, and they were still fighting for championships. And I think that's what Red Bull's been doing since that departure, to not rely on one genius to carry the entire team, to rely maybe on a whole collective. You remember that whole thing that Horner said that he was going to go through a massive management restructure? Well, we might have seen the fruits of their labour, that not one person carries the keys to the Red Bull kingdom anymore. You know, having a more distributed technical leadership, because there are many people within the organisation in designing the car now, instead of just saying, oh, well, Adrian basically does everything. Well, no. That seems to be a trend amongst all of the big name teams, to not rely on one guy and instead have many, many guys and gals. Because that's the best way to survive if you do end up with quite a few departures, and their main remit is not to try and necessarily gain talent, it's trying to make sure you don't lose the talent you've already got and know the system throughout. And that just goes to show why Aston Martin, right now, will fail unless Adrian Newey has managed to pull something out of his arse. Because the point of being a serious organisation is to have a proper workflow. And Aston Martin, they are not doing that by design. It goes to show that either they're not a front-running team or they're not a serious organisation. Take your pick. Also, Skinner himself rose up within the Red Bull system. He is an internal hire, starting back in the CFD department as early as 2006. Him getting the chief designer job at the beginning of the ground effect era in 2022. All at the time when Newey was starting to take more of a back seat in terms of full-on operations and design of the Red Bull cars, and then moving into the RB17 hypercar project. Just goes to show that if the opportunity arises from within, you can actually find talent that you might not necessarily know you actually had until you gave them the entire widget to which to perform. There could be another Craig Skinner-like person within the organisation that knows exactly how to turn on the RB22 and its successors and give Red Bull the opportunity to fight for titles for another few more years. So why does this still feel like a big deal? Well, the role of a chief designer is still a very, very major one, because they are the conduit across multiple different departments when it comes to the car as to who can have the loudest voice, and their department gets the full biscuit. You've got aero departments, cooling departments, vehicle dynamics departments, manufacturing departments, race engineering departments. They all want their departments to be heard the most. That's where experience becomes a weapon, and Craig has that in spades, or at least had. If that filter were to change, the car wouldn't necessarily get slow, but the character of decisions going forward would change. And the characteristics of Formula One, the bigger context, is really changing, because it stopped being an aero-first formula after 4 seasons of the ground effect era, and instead, it's more of an energy-first platform, with aerodynamics potentially being a key multiplier, but not the main star of the show. Because you have got active aero, you've got deployment, you've got harvesting, you've got cooling, you've got all of that to deal with as well. The car behaving, like I said before, as a system. And plenty of drivers have shared their opinions about it and not necessarily liked it, or they've been just saying, well, it's a lot of hard work. Okay, it may be hard work, but doesn't necessarily mean they hate those regulations, and it's being encapsulated by Max Verstappen with that Formula E on steroids joke, and it really pleases me to see that Formula E didn't take that lying down. If you think about it, they really enjoyed the moment with their CEO daring Max Verstappen to prove himself in one of their cars. Ooh, feisty. This has been good publicity for them for sure. But in a world where battery behavior and deployment strategy are proving to be significantly major, losing a senior aero figure does seem less lethal than it would have been if this all went down in the beginnings of the RB21's existence. It might lead to a design language of the cars that isn't necessarily all about making it absolutely tight and compact. You might actually benefit from something that allows more airflow or air dissipation from within. So maybe a boxy car, quite a bulky looking one, might actually be more beneficial for the overall powertrain. And it might also lead to the moment where you don't necessarily have to rely on cooling vents to try and make sure your car doesn't go kaboom. Because if you do add vents, that compromises your aero package and it just changes the design language entirely. Especially when you've got to change active aero modes time and time again. There's also the suspension to consider because you want to have a nice planted car. There are many different facets that make a car go really, really fast in this era. Aero isn't necessarily the big star anymore, but it does play a part. That does have a bit of a knock-on effect. You can't just ignore it entirely. But hey, at least if you have a car that is really good with the cooling and it means the batteries don't overheat and you have all of the efficiency in the world, it'll at least make the driver's time of it a little bit easier. And Max does seem to have a handle on it, but he just doesn't like it. Doesn't necessarily mean he won't win championships or races. Anyway, Skinner leaving right now won't necessarily mean the RB22 in the first few races is going to be an absolute pup of a car. It really depends on what happens when we get to the first major upgrade package, most likely to happen around the time we get to Miami or the beginning of Europe, because those could be the first upgrades bolted onto the car that may not necessarily have been approved by him. And those upgrades will tell you whether or not your own concept of the new regulations are correct or not, or whether it's worth looking at another team and maybe copying them and seeing whether you can integrate those into your own model. And Red Bull, as we have discovered, have been very, very candid regarding their problems with correlation and having to rely more on what Max and Yuki and Liam and Checo have been feeling in their bums, rather than what the computer says. That will change over time. Their simulations have been getting better. They have got that wind tunnel coming up for the beginning of 2027 for sure, maybe as early as this year, but more on that later. And Max also did say that problems aren't necessarily to do with the wind tunnel alone, could easily be down to toxic management, which thankfully doesn't really seem to be the case at Red Bull Racing anymore. So imagine you're a chief designer heading into a full regulation reset with a known history of correlation sensitivity in the recent past, and a brand new power unit program trying to bed itself in. Leaving just before that storm is either a personal life choice, which it usually is, or it's a sign you don't want to be the person holding the hot potato should the data come up with something that is amiss. The hardest weeks for anyone in that role are right now, not back in the middle of last summer. And yes, you might be thinking that this might have been down to some kind of internal disagreement, but I just don't really see that happening, because the majority of all that toxicity left when Christian Horner was sent packing and when Helmut Marko basically resigned. There is not really a major source of toxicity within that team that we all know of anymore. But nevertheless, there is a little bit of a fork in the road when we get a new regulation cycle, and it might have been a fork in the road that Craig may not necessarily have agreed with. But at the same time, it might have been a situation where Skinner realised that, hey, I've reached the limit of my expertise right here. Maybe I should pass on the torch to somebody who might have a better grasp of these regulations in which for them to mature. I've done something that seems to work just fine. My work here is done. Okay, you take it from here, guys. You see what I mean? We don't know the reason why he left. We can't reach any major conclusions here, but I certainly do think that they weren't of the negative kind. Because the most powerful chief designer in 2025 may not be the most powerful chief designer of 2026 and beyond. Because a lot of the competitive advantage with these brand new cars will come from the energy management systems and how that power is translated to the actual car and the way it manages to navigate around a lap, which have clearly shown thus far are very different to what they used to be and what many of the drivers have been learning since their days in karting. I recall Oscar Piastri saying that they basically, in these last few weeks and in the simulator, have to unlearn things they've been learning since they were children in how to manage a car through a corner and down a straight. It's very upheaving for the majority of drivers, and we'll really see who's been able to adapt the best. And so far, Max seems to have a fairly good handle of it. And yes, constraints around the way the battery works with the combustion engine do create an engineering space where software and strategy do change the very face of that lap, as I said. And teams are learning how to make the cars do what they want to adapt accordingly and give their drivers a lower mental load. So the scary thought is this. Red Bull may be reorganizing around a different kind of leadership, one that sits closer to vehicle performance in simulation rather than just pure aero. Now, I'm not saying that's not a priority anymore, that you don't have to worry about what the car looks like and how it goes through an actual wind tunnel, because Adrian Newey clearly has produced something which is really aggressive on the bodywork, even though he doesn't think it's aggressive, and it might come good in the fullness of time, just not right now when the actual energy system, the powertrain, is still in its infancy. And Honda are clearly showing they are very much in their infancy, and I really feel bad for Koji Watanabe having to deal with Papa Stroll's breathing down his neck. Probably makes Ron Dennis look like a bit of a pussycat by comparison. So again, maybe a chief designer's job might be about trying to make sure the car is really effective when it comes to cooling, rather than achieving peak performance through aerodynamics. That might come further down the line, but the first priority right now might just to be make sure the internals are really, really chilled. So if Skinner was more of the old school train of thought of ground effect and aerodynamics being the absolute priority instead of the power unit or the actual systems, then this might have actually turned out to be a really natural handing off point, as in the RB22 is ready to go for Melbourne, the identity of the team is starting to shift a little bit. This will be the first year where Laurent Mekies, the team principal of Red Bull Racing, can really claim that this is his own vision of how Red Bull Racing works. And this is a place where the two-team system really will come to benefit them, and I know this will open up a whole can of worms as to whether or not Red Bull can actually own two teams. The fact of the matter is, though, as of now in 2026, it's perfectly legal. There are limitations as to what they can actually share between one another, but they are definitely maximizing what they can do to the fullest extent of the law. And a clue happened 3 weeks ago, which didn't get picked up by many people, but I did notice it. That Dan Fellows, remember the guy who worked under Adrian Newey, but didn't get on with Adrian? He went off to Aston and made the AMR 23, which was actually good, but went off in a completely different direction. Now he's back in the Red Bull fold as Racing Bull's technical director. Sure, this doesn't mean that he's about to become the senior team's new chief designer anytime soon, but it does something a little bit weirder in my opinion, because it increases the technical competence of the second team, which can turn Racing Bulls into an even stronger development environment. A better training ground for future senior personnel, as well as the junior drivers at the moment, Liam and Arvid. And going into this year, having 4 cars and 2 garages generating data and feedback this directly with one another could be a huge strategic asset. And when you stop to think about it, it really helped the likes of Honda in 2018, with Toro Rosso taking on the power units, learning as much as they can from them. Then when the senior team came a knocking in 2019 with the Honda power units, they managed to get a couple of wins out of it on their very first season working together. And that, hey, Honda actually know what they're doing in the turbo hybrid era after all. They can win races, and not long after that, they could win titles. In theory, 2 works teams, and again, there are limits as to what they can actually share with one another before it does breach the regulations, but the human network within the Red Bull group is really true, because look at the appointment of Laurent Mekies. The team principal of Racing Bulls gets an immediate promotion up to the senior team. There is no gardening leave to consider, there are no checks and balances, because everyone within those 2 teams works for the Red Bull group, meaning they can be hired or fired immediately, they can be shifted within organizations with minimal difficulty. There is an agility with those 2 teams that no other team can claim, even though they may have some kind of technical partnership, with Ferrari and Haas sharing bits and bobs and what have you. And do you recall all of those times with the RB21 when it was difficult and people said, oh, well, Max Verstappen should just go and drive the V-Carb 02 then? It could easily be done because Max works for the same group, so just go to the other team for a bit, in theory. So having a strong sister team means that across those 2 networks, an internal solution as to what direction this car spec can actually go might be discovered that little bit sooner than other teams. And if Dan Fallows is there and comes up with something nice on the V-Carb 03, and it could translate to the RB22 or 23, then you might see this team cooking. And the resources that Red Bull have to hand are probably still better and more calibrated than what Aston Martin has been able to produce at this time. It could easily change. So with that in mind, Craig Skinner leaving looks more like an organisational rebalancing. Also, there is that new wind tunnel to consider, the Year 2 weapon. The team's technical lead Pierre Vacher, remember he is the one in charge of it all, said in January of 25 that Red Bull's new wind tunnel project was ahead of schedule after issues with building permits a couple of years back, and that the new tunnel should be operational by this year. The RB22 might get some attention, it might get some love, but the real priority will be about the RB23. That'll be the car that'll have learned all the lessons from the RB22 and then continue it on from there, whether or not it's worth continuing with their own concept or choosing somebody else's to try and emulate in their own vision. And teams prefer to nominate a facility for a particular year. It would really not surprise me at all if they continue with their current wind tunnel for the RB22, so that means all of the data is the same, and then for the RB23, do that exclusively in the brand new wind tunnel. And besides, within a team like Red Bull and anyone else, 2026 is a really, really volatile year. If there are going to be massive upheavals within the organisation and the driver lineup, it's best to do this all right now and then just deal with the fallout after that. At least there'll be at least some element of continuity and stability. So many new things to consider right here. The priority becomes learning really, really quickly, having the least amount of surprises, and to keep the drivers satisfied with their car, or at least make sure they're not as whiny as some other drivers are. Because it might have been a situation where Craig looked at where everyone was going and looked what he had and might have just gone, well, I don't know what to do. I don't know where to prioritize. And then his exit may have been even more volatile than how you could construe it now. And yes, I know it may seem like to you and maybe other Red Bull fans that I've been sipping a little bit too much copium for breakfast, but that might be a perfectly reasonable read. And also, we didn't hear anything until Racing News 365 dropped that exclusive. They probably would have rather have kept this quiet, so that means they could have tried and find somebody without the eyes of the world on them. Well, I'm sorry, they failed. But yes, it certainly would have been a lot worse if he had left in the middle of the Horner allegations if Christian was still in operations as team principal, and of course back in the ground effect era, and with the whole rigmarole of the RB20 and what to do with it. If they'd lost their chief designer then, who designed the RB19, that would have been a really bad time in 2025. People can point to upgrades not working properly and cite the loss of that figure as the cause potentially. But in a more energy system focused formula, it's really hard to tell what the major problem is, and that's why it could end up hurting more for the team. They may look fine on Australia and maybe even China, but then fall off if the replacement figure isn't up to speed or as effective. Or the car could be fundamentally okay, but the driver starts talking about how frustrating it is to drive, and fans of the team start to worry about whether or not their drivers will stick around. But hey, at least the power unit is performing better than expected, right? That stability could be very, very helpful. And if you're either Toto Wolff or Zak Brown, you're probably not celebrating that headline as I reported to you the other day. Because Red Bull Ford powertrains is a huge pillar of this era. Ford, even used the term pillar, and describing Max Verstappen as another one of those pillars. And as you've been able to tell, there have been plenty of positive noises, it proving to be a lot more reliable than expected, and actually being fairly competitive, providing Max Verstappen a platform to provide a really good amount of laps for this brand new operation. And with the Racing Bull drivers seemingly liking this particular formula, them getting a fair amount of laps too, you really look at the lap count for Red Bull 4 powertrains and think, yeah, for a first year, that's pretty good. And what Max has been able to show in coming up with a trick in downshifts and having absolute energy management whenever he wants it, shows that what Ford Powertrains has been able to do alongside Red Bull is think about drivability. Those quotes I shared with you not that long ago, they've proven to be true. The power unit is reliable, it's been able to do all of those laps, and now they're thinking about drivability, keeping the drivers happy. They can find solutions to the problems of these new regulations, which there are a fair few. As I described yesterday, now there's one to do with the start line procedure. But I can easily imagine that Max has been seeing what's going down in the Red Bull powertrains department and been going, okay, that's not too bad. I like it. I can do something with this. I have something which I can work with. Doesn't necessarily have to like what the rules are. So long as he can do something with them, then that might be enough. A stable, drivable power unit can save you plenty of misery. So maybe Max chose to redirect that misery to the FIA. Then again, having a good power unit plus a confused chassis can wind up being a car that can win sometimes or early in the season, but could end up being awful if the concept and upgrade path turns out to not be the right choice, which is the exact way you make a top driver start mentally looking for the exit, especially with silly season this year looking absolutely bonkers. Thusly, even without Skinner in his position anymore, Red Bull's internal mission for this year is indeed about drivability, thinking about energy efficiency and how well the power unit can work with the drivers, as well as the constantly changing active aero modes. Because again, Craig got that role in 2022 at the beginning of the ground effect era to essentially take over the duties of Adrian Newey when you think about it, designing the actual RB18 and the 19 and the 20 and the 21. Whoever takes on the role will be taking what Skinner was able to help conceptualize with the beginning RB22 spec and make sure it continues to become more easy to drive, less mentally taxing on Verstappen and Hadjar, and to make sure it doesn't fall behind the competition and we start to see more and more irate radio chatter from Max. But the real acid test will come with the RB23. It'll have the brand new wind tunnel, so all of those correlation issues in theory might be put to rest. As well, it'll be the first car fully designed by whoever steps in to Skinner's boots. You know, a brand new leadership rhythm and all. That's where you'll see whether or not all of this has been temporary turbulence as they've been reshuffling their management structure, and to see whether or not they can actually hack it, this team, in the post-Hornet era. So far, it seems to be looking okay. Laurent Mekies has proven that he and the team that he still has can win races with Max Verstappen and still contest for championships. The initial stuff that we've seen in testing and in the shakedown have proven that Red Bull are a lot more solid than we gave them credit for not that long ago. I remember headlines saying that Red Bull 4 powertrains could be near the bottom. No, I don't think so. They are still very much in the big four. And if this had happened during the middle of 2026, it could have been a whole lot worse because you would have had Skinner in there, providing plenty of upgrades at the beginning. They might have fallen off, and then maybe Red Bull would have had no choice but to make some kind of reactive reappointment of somebody else to fill in the breach. Whereas with now, this could be a nice transition point to then pick somebody who can carry them forward throughout the entire season and through an entire upgrade path for the RB22. As well as the initial designs for next year's car too. And had Skinner left days after Abu Dhabi 2025, it would have given the team more time for a clean handover, but it could have also risked shaking the concept of the RB22 that we actually saw in testing, perhaps providing a slightly less certain result for the car they're going to be bringing to Melbourne. So yeah, it would still be nerve-wracking, it still is now, but at least you've got the concept locked in, which proves to be actually pretty solid. So no, Skinner's not thrown a grenade into the Red Bull garage. It might sting for a little bit because the guy's been around the team for 2 decades, of course it will. That's a really big change to try and undertake. But it might provide somebody within the Red Bull organization an opportunity to go, hey, I think I know what we need to do, and it might be something to do with the way we manage the energy, as well as the whole system, and maybe to do with the cooling, and maybe to do with the suspension. So working hand in hand with the chief engineer, as well, of course, the technical lead, Pierre Vacher, as well as making sure the RB22 matures into something that can easily survive through convergence. You know, the phenomena when everyone starts to bunch up and then maybe Red Bull can still remain in the leading pack. Whoever comes in will be more likely better suited to the task than Craig Skinner was. I'm not saying he wasn't an expert engineer, it's just where the hockey puck of Formula One is going might not have been the direction that Craig may have taken that team. So this could easily have been a controlled handing over of power and a means just to call it a day. 2 decades of work for the same team, that's a good excuse to maybe just take a step back and figure out what exactly you want to do next. So fair play, Craig. Fair play. You've earned your rest. We're just used to the narrative that's gone down since Adrian's exit of figures leaving after feeling disillusioned with the Red Bull group. I don't think that's the case on this occasion. Yeah, at the moment it looks like yet more chaos, but it could also be the moment the teams decided to evolve and act proactively, rather than making hasty reactive calls after scandalous dramas and politics. I don't really see that here anymore. But what I do see for you right now is this video, which I know you are going to like. So go and click over there, and I'll see you over there, maybe with a different change of clothes.